Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is David Gabor, and I'm chair of the Wagner Law Group's Labor, Employment, and HR team. I am pleased to be joined by my colleague, Katherine Brustowicz, an integral member of the team. Hello, Katherine.
Hello, I'm glad to be here. Thanks, David.
You got it. Today is actually a very special day. It is not just that we are going to talk about best practices and getting people back to their place of business. No, there is so much more. Today, we are also going to celebrate Dance Like a Chicken Day. That's right. Today is also known as Chicken Dance Day. One of the really cool things about attending a webinar is you can all get up and dance like a chicken, and nobody is going to be the wiser. We're going to identify many things that people should consider in planning for and reopening businesses. There will be takeaways, but also many things for you to bring back to your team so that you can formulate a strategy that best works for your organization. So, Katherine, can you talk about the agenda?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, David, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to go through today's high-level agenda, and we'll get into more specifics shortly. The first point we address surrounds planning. So this portion of the webinar is going to be a discussion of steps that need to be taken prior to employees returning to the workplace. We'll discuss how to define the new normal through revising policies or creating new ones to address workplace issues. Chances are a lot of you are already in this stage. Next, we will walk through situations in which employees are unable or unwilling to work. This needs to be closely monitored and handled cautiously. Every step of this process must be documented. We'll go through it in more detail. Next is communicating with employees. We'll discuss what should be communicated to employees and when in the return to work process. The next phase we'll talk over is when employees return to work. While this will depend to some extent on the industry and the timelines in which states are lifting stay-at-home orders, there are steps that employers should take to ease the transition and acclimate employees to the new safety procedures and new sense of normal in the workspace. Then David will walk us through potential liability. He'll discuss various internal policies, expectations, impact on insurance and benefits, changes to employee classifications in terms of being exempt or non-exempt depending on their job descriptions and actual work performed. He'll also discuss potential disparate impact and discrimination claims, amongst others. We'll end our webinar with some helpful tips in top 10 format so we can leave you with clear takeaways and next steps moving forward. David, if you could advance to the next slide, that would be delightful.
Okay, go ahead, Katherine. I just did.
Perfect. Thank you. So the next slide here is the planning overview. And this slide is a more specific breakdown of the planning considerations that should be addressed and factored into your return to work plan. We'll spend time on each of these bullet points and we'll review key considerations, interactions with building and facilities, transportation concerns, planning the physical workspace, how and when employees return, and additional potential impacts and considerations. David, I've been following the debates and the pros and cons of reopening the economy and balancing health and safety concerns. I'm sure this balancing act is on the forefront of our listeners' minds. Can you get down to the brass tacks of logistical and legal issues and lead us off with key considerations, please?
Sure. Thank you, Katherine, and thank you for asking a question that doesn't have a correct answer. There has been so much debate on the topic, and there is no one answer that is clearly a best practice for everybody. Instead, it's an unimaginably complicated time that challenges the very core of our essence and our being. What we can do is we can derive information that's helpful from the CDC, the WHO, federal and state agencies, as we think about formulating a best practice. You know, we are getting a lot of information from governors and from mayors in different cities, especially larger cities around the country, that can also help us. And really what we need to do is think about what works best for our organization. And one of the things to think about is the nature of what your business does and whether you really do need to get people back to work right away or whether you can stagger people coming back to work or wait a couple of more weeks because you're still able to do your business as you go along. And think of different kinds of businesses and what might work for them. For example, if you have Lucian's Consultancy or Cafasano is an architectural firm where people need to collaborate. Ariake is in the financial business where people can work remote for a longer period of time. Passion Fish is a restaurant that has outdoor seating, and you're in a state and a city where you can get up and running later on this month. And then you've got Jackson's Mighty Fine Food is a caterer, but it's going into people's houses or to other places for events. Maybe that's not a good business to open right away, and you've got to think about these things. Some of the other things to think about is how have you been working over the last 6 weeks? If you have people who are working remotely, how has the performance been? Have they been working efficiently? Do they need to be in the office to be more efficient, or can they continue to work from home and be efficient? Or if they are working from home, do they have all the equipment that they need in order to flourish? Maybe they don't have some things like a good printer, which will help them to continue to work remotely. Talk to the people and talk about what is working, what is not working, and plan, for each company based upon what works and what does not work for your industry, not necessarily some other industry or perhaps a larger company in the same space. And then you consider the ability to return safely. Do you have an office environment? And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the building, the facilities, and your space. Can you make your space as safe as possible? Can you comply with guidelines from the CDC? Can you clean it to your satisfaction and to the satisfaction of people on your team? And then there's a host of planning that you need to think about in order to do this in a way that's efficient. And consider the risk associated with reopening and then try to plan accordingly. Katherine, if you can talk a bit about the building and facilities, that would be really helpful.
Absolutely. So we highly recommend that you check in with your building management to determine what, if any, protocols are being established. This may impact any return to work protocols that you have and how they're designed and how they're implemented. Asking the following questions will help to keep the employer informed and will facilitate more transparent communication and will help employees to feel safer about returning to work. We'll discuss communication in greater detail later in the webinar as well. So pertinent questions that the employer needs to ask building management include, has the space been deep cleaned before employees return to the office? How will the building management change its cleaning practices on a going forward basis to ensure that the workspace is and remains clean and safe? Masks are encouraged by many guidelines, but they may actually be required in public spaces such as elevators and lobbies based on local ordinances or the building management's protocol. Getting a handle on these protocols prior to your employees returning to work will help with a smoother transition and fewer unknowns. Another great question to ask your building management is, have there been any changes to the building's ventilation and filtration systems? If there have been changes, share these changes with your employees. It will continue to foster a trusting work environment, which will only increase employee trust, engagement, and ultimately productivity. Note that space on elevators may be limited for social distancing. Employers may want to consider staggering work hours to avoid congestion. David will speak more to this point in the next slide when he discusses transportation considerations and the use of public transit. David, please take it away.
Well, thank you. Katherine, actually, this is a good tip. And if you want to break out your writing stick, which is what I affectionately refer to as a pen or pencil as, you may want to write down that if you can, have a policy for your business on how people use elevators. For example, you can say, no one is going on an elevator with someone else. You must ride the elevator alone. And if that's doable, add that to your policy. But let's talk a bit about transportation. Think about how your employees are going to get to work. If you have employees in the suburb who commute into the city and they're taking trains, or they live in other parts of the city and they're taking the subway, or what they call in Boston, the T. or are they driving to work? Think about how the employees get to work and consider that as you put together your plan on a going forward basis. If employees are relying on mass transit, whether it's a train, a subway, a bus to get to work, how comfortable are they going to be on that transportation system? In the area you're located in, how is that system working? Are they going to limit ridership to a certain percentage of capacity? Are they working on an optimal basis? What steps are they taking to clean the trains? Think about that before you ask your employees to take mass transit. And consider also the perception that your employees have of the public transportation system. When we talk about communication, talk about the messaging you're giving your employees, about how they're going to get to work. If employees can drive, have them drive. And if they do drive, consider providing parking free for your employees, whether you comp them on a monthly basis or you've got a lot that's available and make arrangements for the employees to park. That will take a lot of pressure off of them. And I would imagine most, if not all, people who are able to drive would much prefer to drive to work than take a mass transit, at least for the next couple of months. It may be that you use a taxi, Uber, or Lyft as a way to help get your employees to work. Some companies that we're working with are going to provide a shuttle service to pick up their employees and get them to work, but only putting a handful of people in the shuttle so they still can social distance. But whatever the plan you use for the transportation to and from work, please make sure that it's accessible to your employees on a non-discriminatory basis. One of the concerns that we have oftentimes is we create a policy, but the policy is good for some people, it's not available to other people, and the people who do not have the policy available to them may say it's unfair. And we have those 7, what I refer to as the 7 protected categories if there is discrimination claims, the 7 deadly sins. And they are gender, race, religion, ethnicity, national origin, age, and disability. And with that, I want to turn to talking about planning and space. As a practical matter, it's a really good idea, in addition to what Katherine was talking about with the building, but look at your floor plan and figure out a way that you can ensure social distancing before your employees come back to work. Think about a place like Disney World or a planned community where they plan every bit of the experience. Now you've got to take a look at your floor plan and figure out how you can maintain social distancing in your workspace. So you've got conference rooms, small rooms, large rooms. You've got hallways. You've got break rooms, bathrooms. You have a kitchen space, a water cooler space. You've got offices, and maybe you've got cubicles. How are you going to plan this so that the employees are going to be able to social distance? A lot of parts of the country now have supermarkets where the aisles have one way. You can only go in one direction, and believe it or not, most everybody has followed that. Not everybody, but most everybody. You probably want to think about doing that in your office space. So if your shape is a rectangle with offices on the exterior and cubicles on the interior, as well as perhaps conference rooms and file space, on the exterior, traffic goes one direction. And you could put up signs reminding people that they need to keep 6 feet apart as they're walking down a hallway. You think about your restrooms. Do you want to make your restrooms one person at a time? And you put a sign up when a person's in the restroom, it's occupied, and then, people go one at a time. That's one of the considerations. In your kitchen space, if you have a kitchen space, perhaps it should be one person at a time so that people can stagger. And then remind people, of course, that you want to hurry up. You can't spend too much time loitering in the kitchen if other people are waiting to use it after you. Also consider policies with respect to cleaning up after you've used the kitchen. Wipe it down. before the next person uses it. Your conference rooms, you probably don't want people having a conference in a conference room unless they're able to sit 6 feet apart when you have a conference. So a small conference room may become an office for somebody who was working in a cubicle and you have this social distancing issues. If your cubicle space is not 6 feet apart, then you may consider staggering when people work because you're not going to fit everybody into the space at the same time. That may be a time to consider who's working more efficiently at home and who's not when you decide who comes in and who doesn't. If you don't have areas that are already established spaces, you're going to probably want to mark things off into 6-foot zones so that people know where they're working. And last but not least, people are putting up barriers. The people who set up cubicles are helping companies now by putting barriers up so that they have a face shield between one person and the next. So those are some of the things to consider as you prepare to get your people back to work. So Katherine, would you be able to talk about how and when people should return?
Sure, but I just have one quick follow-up question for you, David. What happens if somebody doesn't follow the rules that you just described?
Oh, I hope that doesn't happen, but you're right, it may very well. I think the company should make it very clear that if you do not follow the rules, you're subject to discipline, up to and including termination of employment. I think this is one of those times where you really must educate the team before they come back to work. On the first day, everybody's back, and make it clear what the expectations are and just how important these expectations are, because we're talking health and safety. Thank you for bringing that up, Katherine.
Absolutely, and that was a great answer. Thank you for that. So I'm going to talk a bit about how and when employees should be returning to the physical office space. So our recommendation is to have them return in stages. A phased return to work is definitely preferable because bringing the entire workforce back all at once has the likely potential to strain the new safety procedures and can increase risk. So bringing back your workforce in stages has a higher likelihood of compliance and overall success. You'll want to identify employees needed for the first wave, second wave, third wave, and so on. Staggering the return of your workforce can, however, raise potential issues of disparate treatment, disparate impact, and claims of discrimination. Any return to work plan must be carefully reviewed to ensure that it is not discriminatory in practice. For example, you need to consider, are men being called back before women? David had mentioned those 7 protected categories of race, gender, religion, ethnicity, national origin, age, and disability. You need to be very careful to make sure that you're not disproportionately impacting anyone in those particular classes when you're recalling your workforce. To avoid those claims, consider performing a disparate impact analysis to ensure that your facially neutral policies do not have an adverse impact on any protected classes. Also ensure that your decisions are compliant with your internal anti-discrimination policies. Don't forget that any return to work plan must take into consideration any ADA reasonable accommodations as well. We'll go through an example in a few slides on this point, but remember to be as flexible as possible. There may be issues for certain employees returning to work, such as health risks, commuting, or childcare, that may impact the employee's ability to return to work. We need to be mindful of that. One factor that will help deciding which employees should be in that first wave that I described is considering whether an employee has any pressing projects that are anticipated in the next 4 to 12 weeks. Additionally, you'll want to assess how well people are working remotely. Who is essential? If parts of your workforce are working efficiently from home, identify factors and consider the need for their return to the physical office space. If someone is working well remotely and their productivity is the same as it is when they're in the office, come up with compelling reasons for them to come back to the office. Maybe the answer is that it's not compelling for them to return. Or maybe the answer is that others who are not working efficiently remotely have to come back to the office, but this productive worker doesn't. That could lead to employee engagement and morale issues. This needs to be analyzed on a case-by-case basis. Now, don't forget that if employee work hours are modified, it's really important to establish a schedule. Whatever the hours are, there should be a schedule, and that will help with coordinating teams and keeping adhered to client schedules and deadlines as well. Similarly, if transitioning from remote work to office work, a schedule should be established. So for example, you need to think about how many days will the employee continue to work from home? How many days a week will they be back in the office? This schedule should definitely be shared with the whole team. That way everyone can continue working as a cohesive unit. And lastly, to the extent possible, try to plan for the length of each wave. This may be subject to change. A recurring theme of this webinar is the need for us to remain flexible and to adapt because the landscape truly is still shifting. And one more note that I wanted to mention on this slide is for employees who work from home, harassment can still be an issue. I believe that David will talk a bit more about suggested training later on in the webinar, but employers should review whether their supervisors and managers are trained to recognize harassment when employees work remotely. You should check to see are there mechanisms in place for employees who work from home to report instances of harassment. There should be. David, would you mind discussing additional potential impacts of bringing the workforce back to the office?
Thank you, Katherine, and thank you for the reminder about training. One thing Katherine and I are very much aware of, and in talking with our clients, they're not really inclined to want to train very much right now, but they recognize that there's such a big risk if they don't train, especially on things that employees have not been prepared on before, such as working with people remotely, such as some of the impacts that COVID-19 has had on the workplace. But now on to some other potential impacts. And the first thing is that decisions affecting an employee's scheduled return should be reviewed by HR to ensure that the changes are not discriminatory or inconsistent with the employee manuals. So it's important to keep, as much as possible, a centralized approach or unified approach to how you're handling issues arising involving your workers and concerning COVID-19. So for example, one person requests a modified schedule and it's approved by their manager. Another employee requests a modification. It's not approved by a different manager or that same manager. The person whose request is not approved may very well run over, and many of you heard me talk about that famous law firm. Katherine, you've heard of it before. Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. They're out there and they're going to take on cases, and there's a risk of a lot of litigation in the area in the second half of 2020. Let's not make it easy for them by having decentralized decisions regarding some of what's happening. And then we also think about what happens if an employee does not want to return to work. And before I had given examples of Lucian's, which is a consultancy, Capasano was an architecture firm, Ariake is a financial company. And, you know, people working in these type of industries, if somebody says they do not want to return to work, how are you going to handle that? Are you going to say, yeah, you can go ahead and work from home. Another person cannot work from home. You know, you can't go to client sites once we're able to do that legally in different parts of the country. These are some of the things that you want to think about, because in all reality, people have to perform the essential functions of the job. And I know Katherine's going to talk a bit more about some of the criteria to think about when people don't want to return to work. And, you know, other things that we're going to talk about is when people are working remotely, or we've got people on reduced hours like some companies have done, or we've had a change in compensation. Some of our clients have reduced people's compensation by 10, 15, 20%, so everyone continues to work. What's the impact that it has on the benefits for the employees? Then when we start looking at leave policies, and that becomes a big issue on leave policies, because for example, you've got a vacation policy, and the vacation policy is your employees get 4 weeks or 3 weeks a year. Some refer to PTO and say you get 15 or 20 days of PTO for the total year. But realistically, not many people have taken vacation over the last few months, for some reason, I can't imagine why, they've chosen not to take vacations. So they're going to want to take all the vacations in the second half of the year. Your policy manual says, oh, you can not carry over a vacation. And you've got to use it or lose it. Well, now all of a sudden, all your employees are going to be clamoring for vacation in probably the fourth quarter of 2020, and all of a sudden you're going to have half, if not more, of your employees on vacation at the same time if you don't act now. So think about modifying your vacation policy for 2020 for things such as no more than X number of people can take a vacation at the same time. Consider possibly saying that you can carry over 1 week until 2021, or you can cash out 1 week for an extra week's compensation this year. Whatever you do, it's something that you want to think about, because we're going to have to re-examine our employee manual. Our telecommuting policy, we touched on that earlier. Are you going to compensate people if they're parking and they have to pay to park? Things along those lines. You may think about a policy that says that instead of having everybody start at 9 a.m., you've got some people starting at 8, some people start at 9, some people start at 10. And that may be something that you want to add to your policy. Your employee manual also should govern for those who are still working remotely and those who are going to the office. It should govern things such as how they interact with one another. That's something you want to touch on. You make it very clear what they can and cannot do in terms of when they communicate. Is it by text? Is it by email? Is it by Slack, if you've got that kind of program in your business? And last but not least is employment agreements. And this is really one of those critical things, because not all employment agreements are going to, identify what happens if we have another shutdown later on this year. And you want to make sure that you've got an escape clause that protects you and your company in the event that there is a shutdown, later on in the year. So we want to think about a couple of notes. Pay cuts that are implemented during remote work should be reviewed for discrimination purposes. Make sure, again, that we don't have a disparate impact on any of those 7 classes, so we're not committing any of the 7 deadly sins. Under OSHA, employers have a responsibility to ensure that employees are working in a safe workplace in the office. So we have, again, when we design the office and we have things such as our cleaning practices and protocols, that we're at least as compliant with the CDC and perhaps the WHO as well. But fortunately, and this is good news, OSHA does not govern a remote workplace. So an employee who's working from home, OSHA doesn't cover that the employee's home office has to have, any kind of OSHA standards. So that's good. And then carefully documenting all phases of the planning stage to demonstrate that decisions were not discriminatory. Include information available at times on which decisions were made. Because as Katherine mentioned, everything is so fluid. Basically, it's all etched in sand. Make sure that you're documenting what you knew at the time that you created your policy. So, Katherine, what if someone is unwilling or unable to return to work? I touched on that, but can you talk some more about it?
Yes, absolutely. So this is rightfully a concern of many employers. It's really important to be ready to address this situation if it comes up. There are several really important considerations to keep in mind when an employee refuses to return to work. First off, we need to centralize the response. Have a plan in place anticipating that one or more employees may be hesitant to return to work and may even refuse to return. It's really critical for the employer to not be reactionary. Have a conversation with the employee to find out his or her reason for refusing to return. Part of that conversation will include your determination of whether any federal, state, or local COVID-19 laws apply. Be sure to engage in the interactive process with the employee. I'll walk you through an example in just a minute, which will help to bring all these bullet points together. Consider reasonable accommodations as well, including whether or not the employee can work remotely. If the answer to that question is yes, consider whether or not this will become precedent for other employees and what that impact might have. Can or should you terminate an employee for refusing to come back to work? Tread cautiously. Again, this will depend to a large extent on their reason for refusing to return to work. And don't forget to document every step of the process. This is really critical. You need to assume that any documentation you keep may one day be seen by a judge or a jury and could come back to exonerate you should a claim later be filed for a wrongful termination. So let's look at an example now. Let's say we have a 60-year-old type 1 diabetic. He's high risk. This employee says that he doesn't feel safe to go back to the workplace. Here's where the employer jumps into the process and analysis I described. First, has the employer done everything that they can with building management, implementing and distributing safety policies, ensuring social distancing, and providing masks? Let's say yes, they have, but the employee still says he's uncomfortable in returning to work. Note that the 60-year-old type 1 diabetic is covered under the ADA, so he requests a reasonable accommodation of continuing to work from home. At this point, the employer needs to engage in the interactive process and determine, can the employee perform the essential functions of his job by working remotely? If yes, then the employer should allow the employee to continue working from home. But what if he cannot perform the essential functions of his job remotely? It may be uncomfortable for the employer, but this is when the employer says, look, there's no reasonable accommodation. You need to come in and do your job. If the employee comes back by proposing an alternate request for a reasonable accommodation, the employer should analyze that as well. But remember, the accommodation needs to be reasonable. Take into consideration, is it reasonable? What's the impact that it would have on the other employees? Don't forget to document the process. You have to document exactly why the employee needs to come in to do the job. That's really critical. Now, a related issue is if an employer refuses to return to work, do they lose their unemployment benefits? In most situations, yes, unless the reason is legitimate. If employees don't want to return to work because they're at high risk, let's say maybe they're immunocompromised or a type 1 diabetic, or perhaps they have child care issues, then they're in a very different situation than employees not wanting to return because their unemployment benefits are so generous. A CARES Act provision allots an additional $600 per week over and above ordinary unemployment insurance entitlements. This amount can be enticing, and in many cases, this will provide more money than the employee normally would have made when working. So these employees may feel less inclined to return to work before August. In these situations, employers should notify their state unemployment agency when employees are offered their positions and choose not to return. Employees who refuse work may very well become ineligible for continuation of their unemployment benefits, and employers can save on unemployment taxes. Employers may wish to advise any employees who refuse to come back to work that the offer of work has been reported to the state and unemployment benefits will stop as of the intended start date. Those employees should also keep in mind that any dishonest statements made by the employee to the unemployment agency would be considered fraud and may be subject to penalties. So we're going to switch gears from communicating with the state unemployment agencies to communicating with your employees. David?
Thank you, Katherine. Earlier, I talked about several different types of businesses. One was a consultancy, the Lucians. There was an architectural firm, a financial firm, a restaurant, and a caterer. And the reason why I use the examples is because when you communicate with teams, whether we're talking about very high-level experienced consultants, very well-educated architects, financial people, who probably have masters, in their industry, people in the restaurant ranging from chefs to people working front end, to the wait staff and the cleaning staff, and a caterer, which is, a very different kind of business. We're all human. And we all have our fears, and we are all reacting very differently to the impact of COVID-19. Most people I know know someone who's contracted it. Thankfully, we've got some good stories, but we've all heard horror stories, and we know about unemployment and the impact it's had on people. And there are people we know who maybe they've lost a loved one, a parent, a spouse, and everyone is reacting differently to it. So communication from a human standpoint is imperative. We should be communicating with our teams, and we should be explaining what we're doing and, as much as possible, being compassionate with people on the team. And then we talk about the business side of communicating. What are our plans? When are we hoping to open? How are we going to open? What's it going to look like? Are we going to have everybody coming in at the same time? How are we changing our procedures for entering the business? We talked about the elevator a bit. What's our policy? What's our procedure? What about wearing masks, other personal protective equipment in the workplace? Are we going to test when people come in? What's our plan on testing? And all these things, if we explain this to people on our team and we're transparent and we're open and we're honest, people have a peace of mind. So we talk then about the steps we're taking to open and how we're cleaning the office and how we've redesigned the office, and if we've moved some of the cubicles around, if we've moved people's offices or their workspaces so that we can keep people 6 feet apart from one another. All these things we've got to think in terms of not just that we're doing it, but that we're letting people know what we're doing. And, if we've improved the ventilation system, tell the people. How we're cleaning every day, tell the people. If someone has difficulty getting a mask and we have them, tell them we've got masks. What we're doing for social distancing, let your team know. Pat yourself on the back if you're working really hard to make the workplace as safe as possible. People have returned to work. Continue to communicate with them. And the people who are continuing to telecommute, don't leave them out. Make sure that they're in the loop. Include them in meetings. If you're going to have meetings, don't just have it for people in the office. Let them know what's going on. It's fluid. We may be changing what we're doing. We may have some reason on June 1st to change something that made sense on May 31st. It's that fluid time period. Now, contact. People should have a contact person who is their go-to contact person, if there is a change in plan, a change in policy. Make sure that we clearly disseminate those lists and make sure that people have that accessible to them, and if they can't for some reason log in, that they've got their name and phone number of their contact person available to them. We've got to think about employee engagement and morale. We know that we're only as good as our team, and our team is tested right now, and every one of us knows that the team is tested, and the more we're doing to communicate, the better off it's going to be for our team and our morale. And when it comes to expectations, it's wonderful to paint a rosy picture of what today and tomorrow looks like, but if we don't tell the truth to our team, we're doing nobody a favor, and instead we're doing a great disservice. So, Katherine, can you talk a bit about what it looks like when the employees return?
Yes, definitely. So when employees return to work, it's important that you've defined social distancing and health protocols. Consider redistributing your health threat policy as well. As David was mentioning in regards to communication and keeping up employee engagement and morale, it's really important that they have as much information at their fingertips as possible. Then you should decide whether you can or should test employees. For example, many employers are going to start checking employees' temperatures before entering the office space. This is a good idea, but just remember to test in a non-discriminatory way. You can't, in a biased fashion, test specific people only. This puts you at risk of discrimination claims. You should make sure that all of your employees have easy access to hand sanitizers. If visitors must come into the office, there should be hand sanitizer at the reception desk, which visitors should be encouraged to use. Make sure that masks are available in the workplace. Require employees and visitors to wear masks at all times. Consider instituting a no visitors in the workplace unless absolutely necessary policy. You should consider implementing a vendor and client contact policy. You can limit the numbers, ensure there are no handshakes. A wave will do quite nicely, or perhaps an elbow bump instead. Consider teleconferencing when possible, and try to screen your visitors prior to office entry. No employees or visitors should come into the office if they're sick. If employees are working from home well now, consider that to be a continuation. You should be able to continue to work from home. Establish a policy also for self-reporting concerning health symptoms. David touched upon this when he was discussing communication, but it's really important for your employees to know who their contact person is. Internal and external meetings should be held remotely unless absolutely necessary. In-person meetings should only be held in rooms where participants can sit at least 6 feet apart. And don't forget that employees who travel, whether for business or for pleasure, and they're returning from a hot spot, they really need to self-quarantine for 14 days. You should confirm your organization's policy if an employee does test positive for COVID-19, but be careful to maintain the confidentiality of the hypothetical sick employee's identity, and make sure that health records are kept separately from their personnel files. There are HIPAA and ADA privacy violation concerns that can easily be forgotten, so make sure your management team is up to speed. For example, the employer can make an employee who may have been exposed to the sick person aware that they may have been exposed, but they cannot disclose the sick person's identity. David, can you talk a bit about other potential liabilities that our webinar participants should be aware of?
Sure, Katherine. By the way, when you talked about the fact that we can't be shaking hands anymore, one thing that you can think about doing in your organization is something like a jazz hand, 6 feet apart, way that people can say hello to each other, and make it fun. That can go back to employee morale and engagement. So now I unfortunately need to talk about potential liabilities, and I apologize in advance for some of the messaging on this one. But there are risks that are unique to this climate, and the first is stale policies in your employee manual. When you created the employee manual, there was no way to anticipate what was going to be happening over the last couple of months. So what happens is when you do have some people remote, some people not remote, you've got, change in when we're working, how we're working and scheduling, it's going to be unclear to the employees what is expected of them. And from a business standpoint, that's going to affect productivity, it's going to affect morale, it may even impact things like turnover. The employees don't understand what their rights are. They are going to be frustrated and stymied. That's going to create a risk of disparate treatment if managers are not properly prepared on how to work with them. There's a risk of discrimination claims. And oh, by the way, and I'm going to talk more about that in a few minutes, the employment laws, Title VII, ADA, ADEA, the state equivalents, and in some cases city laws, they're still very much in force and effect. Katherine, did you know that earlier this week the EEOC and FedEx reached a $3.3 million settlement on a deaf workers discrimination case?
I'd heard of that, money. Yes.
Yeah.
That is.
So companies really need to keep in mind these laws are still out there, and we have to follow them, and we can't stop our training and preparing our teams for this. It's really important that we make clear what the boundaries are. There's a greater risk of a different kind of harassment when people are working remotely because so much more communication is being done through electronic and social media than ever before. And the boundaries still must stay the same, that we cannot be harassing people because of things like gender or sex. Employee classification is a huge problem. And I'm going to focus today on the exempt versus non-exempt, but don't forget about independent contractor versus employee issue. Here's why. For example, you've got an outside salesperson, and ordinarily they spend up to 9 days out of 10 on the road selling, whether they're selling by going by car or plane or any other form of transportation. Their job is to sell, but they've been working from home. They're not going to people's places of business for a very good reason. And going forward, they may go a little bit, but a very little bit to people's place of business. Instead, they're doing all the work from the comfort of their home and maybe in a couple of weeks from their office. Either way, they may not be exempt anymore under the FLSA. Another example, someone who was in a management position, but now because of the way things are, they're doing a lot of work that is not typically exempt work, and the majority of their day is spent on these other tasks. They may no longer be exempt, and they may very well be entitled to overtime. Managers who manage a team of 2 or more employees, but they're remote now, and people really are on their own, so they can't, in good conscience, say that they spent a majority of their time managing other employees. They may no longer be exempt. In these 3 categories, if they're working more than 40 hours a week, they may very well be entitled to overtime. So employee classification is critical. What do you do about it? Make sure that HR understands not what the job title says, but what these people are actually doing. And then make a determination if they are still exempt or maybe they're not exempt. Another thing to touch on is if people are working in a different state from their office and they now are subject to the rules and regs in that other state as opposed to the state where the office is located. Take some time to make sure you understand what the employee's rights and what your responsibilities are under this other state, and whichever is more generous is the policy you should apply for that employee. I hate to say it, but training is still something that we should be doing. And instead of looking at it as something that's a bad thing or a negative thing, it's a good idea that we look at it as a positive. And why is it a positive? We don't have time for anything more. Simple. You can do training now on Zoom or some other platform similar to Zoom. You can bring someone in to do training in groups of people. And what you can do is you can blend in your core values, your mission statement, reinforce your brand, reinforce that you want this to be a great place to work. So, on the one hand, you're going to train so there's no harassment. You're going to train so employees know how they can report issues that arise, because maybe instead of just going down the hall to HR, they need to know what they should do now if they have a problem, and we could train on that. It's still a good idea to train on things such as diversity and inclusion. In reality, there's been some issues regarding some harassment of Asian Americans and African Americans over the last couple of weeks that have come to our attention. And actually, Katherine and I have had several conversations on the topic. And it's as important now as it was going into 2020 to train on D&I. Very, very important. And also bullying. Let's just make sure that there's no risk of bullying, even just how managers are communicating with their teams. And, Katherine touched on, if people get sick, what do we do? Do we send them home? She talked about that a bit earlier, and that's an important thing to think about in terms of how you're going to handle this, because what happens if there is a situation where an employee does get sick? How are we going to handle it? And privacy. Privacy is in several phases. One is the fact that if people are working remotely still and they've got access to company information, that's one issue. Second would be if they have access to the client or customer's information. And third, if they have access to any employee information and they're working remote. One of the risks is if they're printing things out or they're using a computer that's shared with other people, whether it's a family member or a roommate or someone else who comes to visit has access to the computer. Now, all of a sudden, that's a third party who's got access to either your company information, your client or customer's information, or potentially personally identifiable information regarding a coworker of yours. how are you handling this? What steps are you taking to protect this information from being accessed by a third party? How are you doing that, and how are you training and preparing your team for it? So from that point of view, privacy is a real issue. Insurance is the last point I wanted to touch on this slide. Directors and officers insurance is a good thing to think about. Creditors suing due to a lack of liquidity, unfair competition suits, shareholders suing for breach of fiduciary duty, discrimination, harassment, wrongful termination, the ADA and state disability suits arising out of the pandemic, breach of fiduciary duty to stock dropping, wage and hour due to misclassification suits. These are all things that can bring about litigation. If you've, in the past, refrained from having insurance to cover some of this stuff, it might not be a bad idea to think about it. And now, without further ado, drum roll please, it's our top 10 list. Katherine, can you kick it off, please?
Yes, thank you, David. So the number one tip here is don't open too quickly. Make sure that you have a plan in place before you open your physical office doors. Anticipate potential employee concerns as we discussed and have a response ready. During times like these, it's smarter to act out of an abundance of caution and act prudently. Tip number 2, let employees know what you're doing and communicate clearly. Knowledge is power, right? Employees who are well informed will have a better sense of what to expect and will feel less anxious to return to work. They'll also feel that the company or organization is invested in their well-being. That strengthens your company's brand and loyalty. Strong communication is powerful. In a similar vein, don't forget about the mandatory posting requirements. All businesses with 500 or fewer employees must post the FFCRA Act poster. That's the Family First Coronavirus Response Act. So that's another way to communicate, making sure that your employees are aware of their rights.
Katherine, that's a great point. If employees are working remotely and they're not in the workplace, do you think it's a good idea to have the company email this out to all its employees to establish that they've disseminated those rights in that poster?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great idea.
Yeah, I think that works. The third point is following CDC federal, state, and local guidelines. And what Katherine had said earlier, which is really important, is when you do your planning, document what you're doing and document what we knew at the time that we made those decisions, because the guidelines are changing oftentimes more than once a day. And there's, messages coming from the CDC. They're telling the Senate one thing. The White House is saying the second thing. The governor of Massachusetts is the third thing. And the governors from New York and Virginia and California have different points. And then the mayors are saying things different. What you want to do is, to the best of your policy, at the very least, as a baseline, follow the CDC's guidelines. Then also the guidelines established by your state, by your governor's office. And then if you're in a local area with guidelines, those guidelines, at the very least, follow the highest level, as far as that's concerned, and document what you're doing and make sure that you stay up to date so that when when something else comes out, you may have to make adjustments, and make it very clear that you have updated and made these adjustments, and then you're communicating, like Katherine said, to your team. All right. Anticipating employees' concerns is another thing that we had wanted to talk about. Employees are scared, and as I said earlier, they've got a lot of good reasons why they're concerned. So if they're going to work and they're afraid of what may happen, they're concerned about the unknown, concerned about the virus, concerned about a family member who lost a job, whatever that is, try to understand what their concerns are, and the more you can get ahead of those concerns, the better it is in terms of being able to get your team back working and functioning and working at 100% efficiency, or as close to it as possible. Katherine?
Great, thank you, David. Our fifth tip is maximizing telecommuting if possible. So many potential risks can be mitigated by allowing telecommuting to continue if it is working well. Even if employees begin to come back to the physical office space, remote or digital meetings should still be encouraged over large gatherings in conference rooms. So we had discussed earlier about employees being able to meet their essential job functions. If they are able to meet those functions from home, you should really consider whether or not it makes sense to bring them back to the physical office space or not. The more that we can work remotely, the more that we are less at risk of exposing one another to potential coronavirus.
Thank you. I talked about insurance policies just a moment ago, but there's another thing to think about, and that is if someone does get sick and is traced back to your workplace, whether it's an employee, a vendor, a salesperson, a client, or whomever, and it gets traced back to your workplace, there's a risk a lawsuit gets brought. And the best thing to do is to determine whether or not you've got insurance that will cover that lawsuit. Because people buy insurance not for what they can afford, they buy insurance for what they cannot afford. So I do think this is one of those opportunities, as one of the takeaways to take back to your team. Analyze the coverage that you have now and determine whether your coverage can touch on all the things that we spoke about during this webinar and also any other concerns that you've got. I think that's something to do that I think makes really good sense. And it may very well be that the insurance that you purchase is not nearly as expensive as you thought it might be, considering the benefit it's going to inure to your business. Katherine?
Thank you. Our seventh tip is training on privacy. So we should train on privacy of the data of our business, our clients, and employees. We discussed keeping health information confidential, but we also need to remain vigilant against threats such as cyber attacks and the threat of our organization's data security. David had also mentioned the importance of being aware of potential third-party access to our data. Now, if employers have a bit of time on their hands at the moment, they should consider expanding their trainings past privacy to such things as harassment prevention, and as David had mentioned, diversity and inclusion. You can also consider performing management training now. David?
Oh, thank you. You know, the expression "everything is etched in sand" is something that one of our colleagues had shared with us a few days ago, and it's just really a good way to look at what's happening right now. When companies had to shut down or go remote, and they were doing it based upon really very little notice and no precedent ever in our lifetime, certainly, you know, for this kind of a reaction to the pandemic. We were reactionary. Now that people are coming back to work, we have a chance to be proactive. And one of the expressions I love to use with HR teams is shift the view of HR from a cost center to a profit center. And I say the same thing with my friends who are general counsel of companies. You know, you're not a cost and a necessary expense of doing business. You're part of the team that makes money for the business. This is when you guys, the attorneys, the HR people, this is your chance to shine. Come up with ways to blend what we talk about in terms of best practices, legal risks, and the communication and how we're reaching out to our team, and then how we're going to be reaching out to our clientele and the general public in our communicating, so that we can actually be proactive and get ahead of the curve. This is really such a good opportunity for all of you. But keep in mind that it's so fluid that do take the time to be aware of whatever changes come up. And then existing employment laws. This is something that, you know, we've talked about and our clients know because we remind them all too often how important it is for them to be vigilant. If you are in a state where you've got mandatory harassment prevention training, that's not excused. if an employee is sued for sexual harassment, you can't say, but it's a pandemic, we didn't have a chance to do an investigation, or they didn't bring it to our attention. Maybe they couldn't because they don't know how to reach out to the person at this time. But in any event, your responsibility is not excused. So just keep a step ahead, as much as humanly possible, and that would do us all a big favor. Katherine, you want to hit on the last point, number 10?
Absolutely. So the last point is to set and manage reasonable expectations. You should caution all employees to be flexible and to be patient. Day-to-day operations are unlikely to return to normal. No one knows what the new normal will look like. We all need to be adaptable, and again, keeping up communication with employees as changes occur will be super important and helpful. We should all aim to be employers who demonstrate genuine compassion and concern for our employees, their safety, and well-being. We don't know what the future holds or how the future will unfold, but if we stay in constant communication and remain transparent and flexible, our odds of success are definitely heightened. David, did you want to briefly mention our bonus tip?
Yeah, and the reason why auditing is important is because we still have equal pay laws. We've got affirmative action responsibility. We want to make sure that our employees are being paid properly, even if they're working remotely, employee classification. These are things that do require auditing, and I know that all of you are busy in many respects, but if you do take the time to audit, it's a heck of a lot cheaper to do an audit on equal pay, for example, than defending a class or collective action on equal pay. So that brings this webinar to an end. And Katherine and I are HR and employment law nerds. Why do I mention that? We love talking shop. So you are welcome to email us and call us with any questions that you've got. You don't need to be someone who's hiring the firm to talk shop with us. We look forward to hearing back from you and helping you to navigate getting your employees back to work safely, responsibly, and in a way that's going to give you the best chance to flourish. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Katherine, as well.
Thanks very much. Take care.